get to that level.
Okay, start from the beginning.
All right, here we go. I'm Jim McCann. I'm still Jim McCann. Let's move on. So here's what I hope to do today, folks. I'll give you an overview of Maryland biodiversity, and an overview will just be scratching the surface. Talk about why some species, plants and animals, aren't doing too well, why some are declining, why some even have either no longer occur in our state or are extinct altogether. Talk about some of the species and habitat conservation priorities in the state of Maryland, and kind of addressing it from more of a holistic viewpoint. And finally, give you some habitat conservation guidelines to take home and consider for your property, from forests and streams to maybe some unique or rare habitats you have in your property, grasslands, early successional habitats, and finally, good old backyards. There's always something you can do right outside your door for the benefit of wildlife. So Maryland is really an interesting state. If you're an ecologist, you quickly learn that Maryland kind of lies at this biological crossroads. We have many species that are at or near the southern end of the range here in Maryland, and we have quite a few species that are at or near the northern end of the range. We lie a few hundred miles south of the southern extent of glaciation, so we had a lot of species that were pushed southward, and in the post-glacial period recovered, so we have remnant populations of species that are relatively boreal. They're still hanging on here. We also even have some species that are typically associated with prairies, and these species established themselves during a certain portion of the post-glacial period called the hypsothermal, about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. Some plants and animals that are still occurring here that you would typically find, say, in Indiana or Iowa. Really interesting. And if you were just to take a drive across the state, you would begin, say, on Assateague Island, and you'd hop on 50 and you travel a couple hundred miles across our state. It's just amazing, you know, the diverse landscapes you're going to cross through. Everything from a barrier island right along the coast, to salt marshes, to lowland forest on the eastern shore, passing through the rolling terrain of central Maryland, Montgomery County, Harford County. Then you approach the Catoctin Mountains and the Blue Ridge. You head over the Catoctin Mountains, then over South Mountain. You keep on going across the broad valley here, which is where we are right now in the Hagerstown Valley. Continue west over Silent Hill Creek through the Green Ridge State Forest, past Cumberland, into what I think of as the best part of Maryland, Garrett County, where I live, but I'm a little biased. I have a little company on that at least. But at any rate, you know, it's for a little state, it's got a lot going for it. I think we all know that if you've been a resident of Maryland for a long time. So I'm talking about wildlife today, and wildlife is broadly defined, means all sorts of things. And if you think about here in Maryland, look at this bar graph. This is simply the number of species for different groups of animals, in this case, not plants. Just amazing, 97 species of mammals occur in the state. Everything from bats, shrews, voles, mice, mink, otter, whales, manatees, a recent addition to our fauna. Birds, 450 plus species have been documented in Maryland. About half of those are known to regularly nest in our state, so about 220 species nest in our state. Everything from bald eagles and robins to cerulean warblers to black rails. Real diversity. 49 species of reptiles. That includes, if I remember this correctly, 24 species of snake, 17 species of turtle. Amphibians, 19 species of frogs and toads, 22 species of salamander. Just amazing. Fishes, freshwater fishes. Fishes alone in our non-tidal streams and rivers tally over 100 species. And just go on and on and on. You know, dragonflies, 184 species, butterflies, 157. Moths, these unsung little critters that go unnoticed that spend a lot of time flying around at night. Approaching 3,000 species have been documented in the state, and I think we're just scratching the surface. Beetles, the most diverse group of any living macroscopic animal in the world. You know, there have been over 2,000 species documented in Maryland. Worldwide, about 400,000. And the list keeps on growing every year with new species being described, and so on and so forth. So wildlife means a lot of things, and I'll just throw in a number for plants. I'm a zoologist. I know something about plants, but I'm not a botanist. But we have about 3,000 species of plants that are known from our state. So in addition to that species level diversity, we have a lot of different habitats and ecosystems. The photo on the left is a photo of the Allegheny River corridor in far western Maryland. Beautiful area if you ever get a chance to visit it. We have some beautiful wetlands. We have some unique habitats. This right here is a shale barren, a rare habitat that in Maryland is only found for the most part in Allegheny County. We have dozens of shale barrens in Green Ridge State Forest and nearby areas. So why conserve biodiversity, this diversity of life? There's lots of reasons. I think everyone here, they have their own reasons. Obviously, you're attending this conference, you have an interest in doing something good for the benefit of wildlife and conservation. We know the ecosystems do good things for us. If you're living along a coastal area, we know barrier islands, tidal marshes help buffer coastal storms, help protect our land and our property. We know that we get a lot of things from the earth. We get a lot of food, we get a lot of materials that we build with. We get a lot of things that help us health-wise. The majority of our medicines are derived from plants. The vast majority are. In recent years, scientists have uncovered some interesting chemicals with a snail called the rosy periwinkle and a plant called the Pacific yew. And together, those two organisms provide some really useful chemicals for anti-cancer treatments. Who'd have thunk? A lot of social and cultural values. Think about the blue crab, the iconic crustacean here in Maryland. What would Maryland be like without crabs? Even us in Garrett County can appreciate the loveliness of crabs. Now, who can imagine going out in the woods in the fall and not seeing bucks and rutt, not seeing that phenomenon take place year in, year out, whether you hunt or not? Now, I'm a hunter. I mean, it's just a phenomenal thing. Or if you have a little wetland on your property in the spring, you hear spring peepers every spring, salamanders are coming to breed, spring wildflowers are up. These are things that just mean something to us in personal ways, but they are of value. And finally, one could say, there are some moral reasons. Should we contribute to the loss or the extinction of the species? How many people are familiar with Aldo Leopold? That's a good show. He's a really interesting guy, played a big role in wildlife conservation, not just in the United States, but worldwide. He's considered by most to be the father of modern wildlife management and conservation. And I won't read this quote, but some of you are familiar with his writings, probably recognize this. So as I mentioned earlier, I work for Maryland DNR within Wildlife and Heritage Service. Not to get too bureaucratic in how we're organized, I work for a part of that unit. It's called the Natural Heritage Program. And our primary responsibility is the gathering of information on rare, threatened, endangered plant and animal species, databasing that information. We play a lead role in the state listing of plant and animal species here in our state under our Non-Game and Endangered Species Act. And we do a lot of research, we do a lot of monitoring and surveys. We collaborate with a lot of other folks who have expertise, folks in colleges around the state. And we also get involved in a lot of habitat management issues and ecosystem management issues. I just want to quickly give you an overview. We have about 24 staff, ologists of different kinds and database managers, people who are experts in reptiles, plants, amphibians, ecological restoration, mammals, birds. And we try to assess the status of every vertebrate, as many invertebrate species as we can, and plants as a whole. And there's a rich body of science that talks about what contributes to the decline or extinction of a species. And usually there's three common factors that you can look at regarding a species. It's range. Where does it occur? Does it live in a small area? Does it have an expansive range that occurs throughout a region or a continent? What is the size of the population? Small, medium, large? And what are its habitat requirements? It's really picky about where it lives, or can it live in a variety of habitats. So those three factors, range, population size, and habitat specificity, play a big role in how vulnerable a species is to decline and extinction by things that humans are doing on the landscape. And I'm not going to spend much time on this. And so if you dive into that further, we look at factors like, again, the range, extent, population size, how many populations, what are the viability of those remaining populations, what are the population trends to the extent that it's known, what are the threats. And we use that information to come up with state ranks, and state ranks are used to assess the status of a species. That has no legal implications, but this does, and there's a federal equivalent to that as well. Endangered and threatened are two federal legal statuses. And so we spend a lot of time, and it may take a decade or two before we have sufficient evidence to really go forward with the state listing recommendation for our state legislature. Now, sorry, this slide here. There's the federal legal statuses. What's interesting about this, well, there's a lot of things that are interesting about it, but so I work for the Maryland Natural Heritage Program in Maryland DNR. Every state in the country has a similar agency. It may not be called the Natural Heritage Program, but they're doing the same thing. Every Canadian province, I think just about every country in the Western Hemisphere has something different. Something similar. And all of that data is archived in one place called the mothership. NatureServe houses all this data. Used to be part of a nature conservancy, but they broke off years ago. But nonetheless, it allows you to take all that data. Let's say you want to do a range-wide assessment of a species. You take all that data and get a great look at how a species is doing throughout a given area. In this case, the black rail. And just real quickly, the red indicates a species that is S1, critically imperiled, highly rare. And so you look at all the states where black rail has occurred. And by the way, the blue, the light blue SH means historical. It's no longer there. The dark blue is extirpated, meaning it's probably gone. So just look at all the red, dark blue, and light blue. And you can see throughout the entire species range, and the orange is imperiled but not critically so, but still, this species is not doing well. And so right away, if you're interested in doing a status assessment on the species, you've got a lot of great data that's already captured and allows you to put some good science into making some tough decisions. Black rails, by the way, anyone know what a black rail is? It's a little bigger than, I think it was you that described the grouse as these little cute balls of feathers. This bird is about mouse size, and it lives in salt marshes. And it used to be 30, 40 years ago, the lower Chesapeake Bay area, the salt marshes in Fishing Bay, down near Deal Island and the backside Asti, that was one of the best places in the world, if you're a bird watcher, to go and find black rails. And we've been doing a lot of intensive monitoring, and we have very, very few places where this species still occurs. And although we're still trying to tease out what's going on, it's likely that the primary reason why this species isn't doing too well is because of sea level rise. It's a species that has always occurred. It favors the upper ends of salt marshes where it just wants its feet a little bit wet, not down there in the tidal creeks where you get some big tidal fluctuations. And just probably small changes in sea level rises has affected this species. Another thing we can do with all this data, we can take a look at which groups of organisms might not be doing too well. So here, this is the percentage of the species within each of these groups, over here on the y-axis, that are imperiled or extinct. And so if you look at the top one, the top group, 69% of the freshwater mussels in the United States are either imperiled or gone. About 300 species have been documented in the United States, so that's a lot of species that aren't doing well. Take a look at the top 5 groups. See a common theme there? They're all aquatic. Yeah. It tells you something about how our streams and rivers and aquatic habitats are doing. Not too well. And we could do something similar just at a Maryland scale. One thing that you'll see that's quite a bit different here is we have this little anomaly over here, this tall bar of cave invertebrates. Maryland has a remarkably high number of very rare animals that occur in caves. In fact, Washington County is ground zero for cave biodiversity. A lot of species that are found in limited numbers outside of this county are found here. There are some species that only occur in a cave or two, some of which occur in Washington County. It's pretty interesting. You could also look across different parts of the state. AP stands for Allegheny Plateau, which is essentially Garrett County. Ridge and Valley, RV, would be the Green Ridge area, east to the Catoxins. Piedmont, UCP is Southern Maryland, LCP, Lower Coastal Plain would be the Eastern Shore. And this is simply a summary of the number of rare, threatened, endangered bird species, breeding bird species, by region and habitat. So for example, 22 rare, threatened, endangered breeding bird species occur in forested habitats in Garrett County. On the Eastern Shore, 43 occur in tidal wetlands. So as a state natural resource agency, this is useful information. We have limited time, money, and staff, and it helps direct where we should be spending our time. And of course, when it gets down to how we manage public lands, this information is really useful. Our program is involved quite a bit in land management planning on our state forest, our state parks, sometimes on federal lands like Cedar Canal National Park. Well, threats to biodiversity. Not to get too grim here, folks, but there are a lot of things going on in our world that aren't on a real positive trajectory here when it comes to the environment. And some of these may be quite familiar to you, but habitat loss and fragmentation and degradation. I'll talk about fragmentation here in a little bit if you're not familiar with that term. Are one of the leading causes of decline and extinction in species throughout the world. Invasive species, I'm sure just about everyone here is aware that invasive species are a really big issue. When I was in college, way back when, it was barely on the radar screen. And it's amazing how my profession has evolved and changed, in large part because of invasive species. It's something that can't be ignored. Climate change. Now, it was on the radar screen when I was in college, but I think folks are still waiting to hear how the story was going to end. The story hasn't ended, but we're getting a better look at it, and climate change is a serious issue. Loss of natural disturbance regimes. What do I mean by that? A lot of our habitats here in Maryland depend on an occasional disturbance. Fire is one of the leading causes of disturbance in an ecosystem, and that's a good thing. A lot of plants and animals need fire to reproduce. If you're a plant that's dependent on fire, a lot of plants need fire to germinate, and we've done such a great job with getting folks to not set fires accidentally, which is a good thing, but we still need some periodic fires. And that's tough to do when you live in a Maryland landscape where we have a lot of people, a lot of communities, and trying to safely do prescribed burns is hard, but it is contributing to the loss of plant and animal species. Pollution, toxins, probably not an unfamiliar topic for you folks, is a big issue. Disease, wildlife diseases, I'll talk about bats and white nose syndrome, which is one of the most devastating diseases that have ever hit North American wildlife. And finally, illegal collecting and overexploitation. Used to be a bigger issue in years past. It's morphed into something different nowadays. There are some plant and animal species that are highly sought after, highly valued. Certain amphibian and reptile species are highly valuable in the illegal pet trade, this dark world of, this dark market of trading that goes on. There's certain plants, even insects, folks. And to some of the data that we collect, we keep a tight lid on. Unless someone really has a good reason to use it, we just don't give it out to everyone. So if someone's interested in collecting a highly valuable turtle, we divvy out that information very carefully. So how many species have we lost? Well, As best as we know, with that big qualifier, about 111 plant species and 23 animal species. In Maryland, correct. Since, as best as we can. In very general terms, our losses in wildlife have occurred in kind of two waves. The first wave is more of an historical wave. You can imagine after European settlers first arrived here in North America, there was a lot of forest clearing, there were a lot of changes that went on, a lot of predators were not looked upon favorably. There were bounties on wolves and mountain lions, which we no longer have here in Maryland. So those species were lost. Up until the 20th century, we had no science-based wildlife conservation laws. And so there was a lot of market hunting. You could go to an open market in Baltimore, probably in 1905, and find dozens of bird species that were shot and brought to the market that are illegal to hunt now. What are called? Punt guns, yeah. Punt, P-U-N-T. And real quickly, I'll describe what a punt gunner would do with these guns. It would be mounted on a boat, a small wooden boat. The gunnels will be really set low, just above the water surface, sit low in the water. The intent was to get up as close as you could to waterfowl. And that gun would be loaded with just about anything, loaded up with nails or bearings, whatever you could put in it. And when you fire that gun, it was like firing a cannon. I can imagine the recoil on this little guy compared to this guy. And you could take down dozens, if not scores, or maybe even 100 birds at one time. And that had a big impact, you can imagine, on wildlife. And so, fortunately, that doesn't occur anymore, but it's an interesting little piece of our history. Most of Maryland was predominantly forested, and we had a lot of old-growth forests. We have just a few scattered remnants now here in Maryland. And most of those are in western Maryland. And most of those have just kind of been missed. They haven't persisted. They're not remnants by design. It's kind of by accident. They may have been on slopes that were too steep, maybe on a mountain ridge that was too difficult to access. But nonetheless, we still fortunately have some remnants. And so with this first wave, this historical wave of extinction, which included the industrial age and a lot of pollution going into our streams and rivers, we lost some things. We lost the passenger pigeon, which used to just be so numerous it's hard to imagine, would darken the skies. We lost Carolina parakeets. Yes, we had parakeets here in Maryland, Carolina parakeets. Heath hens, which is a eastern subspecies of the prairie chicken, which is still around, not doing well, but out in the Midwest. We lost wolves. This says gray wolves, by the way. It should say red wolf. Some new genetic studies have come out, and it's likely we never had gray wolves, we had red wolves. Just a little tidbit there. For those of us from Garrett County, we have lost some species. We used to have snowshoe hares. We used to have a bird called the Swainson's thrush. We used to have northern flying squirrel. By the way, all these species are dependent on red spruce forest. And most of the red spruce forests have been logged out by the beginning of the 20th century. And with that, these species unfortunately didn't fare well. If we go to the other end of the state, down the lower eastern shore, we used to have red-cockaded woodpeckers, which were associated with these old loblolly pine semi-open forests. We used to have this interesting little butterfly called Hessel's hairstreak, named after the man who discovered them, Dr. Hessel. And Hessel's hairstreak, the larvae, the caterpillars, eat nothing but Atlantic white cedar. They can't have anything else. Well, like red spruce in far western Maryland, most of the Atlantic white cedar was logged out by the early 20th century, and with it, Hessel's hairstreak. It still occurs in a few locations just north in Delaware, but there hasn't been a confirmed record for this species since I think the 1940s. Okay. So real quickly, here's a quick pie chart of our state-listed animals here. I'm skipping all the plants again. I'm a zoologist. But one thing that might stand out for you is this big red pie here, slice of the pie. 74 of our state-listed animals are invertebrates. So that includes butterflies, some species of beetles, dragonflies, cave crustaceans. So those are some of the organisms we're talking about. So what I want to do now is just give you a quick overview of some of our endangered species. And I'm going to start in the far western end of the state, and we're going to travel eastward. And we'll begin with this little guy right here. This is the southern rock vole. It's a highly rare small mammal that occurs in the central and southern Appalachian Mountains. It's associated with old growth forest, really moist, old forest, lots of rotting logs. Not just any forest, it's a forest where you have a bouldery slope with springs emanating from that slope. And it's very picky about where it lives. It needs a certain type of microclimate. It spends much of its ground under those boulder fields, underneath this old growth forest. There are only a few places left in Garrett County where it still occurs, all on state forest land. The Castleman River. The Castleman River is an interesting river. It has two state endangered species, the hellbender on the right and the stonecat on the left. This is the only place where stonecat still occurs in Maryland, and it's one of only two places where the hellbender still occurs. It still occurs in the Susquehanna. We still have a small population persisting in the Youghiogheny, but maybe the Castleman is as good as it's going to get right now for the hellbender. The hellbender is a salamander. It's the largest salamander in Maryland. It gets about this long, and it feeds primarily on crayfish. And both of these species, especially the hellbender, are very sensitive to changes in water quality. And Castleman has had a kind of a mixed history. A lot of acid mine drainage from coal mining over the years, some impacts from farming. The town of Grantsville is close by, and you have an outflow pipe from a water treatment facility that is better than what it used to be, but it's likely it had some contribution to the decline of hellbenders. But they're mostly confined to about a 4 to 5 mile section of the Castleman River. Once the Castleman River flows north into Pennsylvania, eventually into the Yacht, eventually into the Ohio. But once you get into Pennsylvania along the Castleman, there's an area where there's a lot of acid mine drainage, and hellbenders are absent from there. It's a very isolated population. This guy right here, the Allegheny Woodrat. This is an example of a species that hasn't done well for a variety of reasons, but disease has been one of them. And the disease is brought to them by a roundworm, which is carried by raccoons. Our raccoon populations are probably higher than they've ever been in Maryland. And raccoons love to hang out in the same areas where Allegheny woodrats do, which is expansive cliff areas, rock outcrops. Raccoons like to spend a lot of time there. That's where they den. And they leave their feces there. And wood rats, otherwise known as pack rats, will grab all sorts of items to cache and attract a mate. And that can include raccoon feces. And those feces contain the roundworm, which is deadly to them. By the way, it's deadly to us as well. So at any rate, that's one of the reasons why wood rats aren't doing well. We also have lost, for the most part, American chestnut, which used to produce just an enormous amount of nuts, mast, and was really critical for a lot of wildlife species. And wood rats, that was probably one of their main foods. So this species isn't doing too well. I mentioned mussels earlier. You think about oysters in the bay. Oysters aren't doing too well. They're doing a little bit better than they were, say, 10, 20 years ago. Oysters, this iconic bivalve in the bay, it's a great indicator of water quality. They provide ecosystem services in the form of filtering millions of gallons of water. Well, the non-tidal, or the freshwater analog to oysters, are these freshwater mussels. And they haven't fared so well either because of declines in water quality in our streams and rivers. Green floaters is arguably the most endangered freshwater mussel in Maryland. It is state endangered. This is Siding Hill Creek, which forms the border of Allegheny and Washington counties. Siding Hill Creek by far supports the best remaining population of this highly rare mussel because of the relatively good water quality in Siding Hill Creek. Beetles, who'd have thunk, beetles. This guy right here, the Northern Barron's tiger beetle, this bright green beetle with these white spotting patterns, occurs in very specialized habitats that need periodic fires to open up the canopy and expose these sandy open soils. That's where the larvae of the beetle occurs. In the absence of fires, this beetle is gone. It's So here's an example of a species that needs fire. Here's another species that needs fire every once in a while. The Olympia marble occurs in shale-barren habitats, primarily in Allegheny County. The larvae, the caterpillars, feed on rock crests. And shale barrens are these dry, south-facing steep slopes that do receive periodic fires once in a while, at least they should, and that helps maintain the habitat for this rare butterfly. Bog turtles. How many have heard of bog turtles? Okay, when I talk about illegal collecting, this is probably the poster child right here. There's a terrible black market out there, folks trying to get their hands on this, all because somebody in Japan wants to have a bonsai garden, and they think a bog turtle is the best thing to have. So, and they go for hundreds and hundreds of dollars, just one turtle. This is a federally listed species as well as a state listed species. It is only found in central Maryland, and it's very specialized in its habitats. It occurs in these spring-fed, sedge-dominated, semi-open wetlands. It doesn't have to be a real big wetland. It could be as big as this room. That might support a small population. Barking tree frogs occur in this specialized wetland habitat called a Carolina or Delmarva Bay. It's a seasonal wetland. I'll talk about those habitats in a little bit. And finally, now we're down along the Pocomoke River near Astig Island. Swainson's warbler, arguably one of the rarest breeding birds in Maryland, is only found as a nesting bird along the lower Pocomoke River drainage on the lower eastern shore. And then finally, frosted elfins it's a butterfly that, for the most part, with one exception, only occurs on the lower eastern shore. It too occurs only in these fire-dependent, dry oak woodland habitats. The larval host plant is also a state-listed species, wild lupin. And unfortunately, deer love to eat it. It's like candy. So to help the frosted elfin populations hang on, we have to fence off at least some of the host plant so the frosted elfin can reproduce successfully. And then finally, black rail. I mentioned that earlier. This is this diminutive little black bird that occurs in salt marshes, usually expansive salt marshes, hundreds or thousands of acres, primarily on the lower eastern shore, and it's not doing well at all. And here, this is Dorchester County. This is where things stand right now as far as the extent of Dorchester County. And with sea level rise projections at about 0.7 meters by 2100, and I think those numbers have gone up now. This is what we're going to have left. Is anyone from Dorchester County? Okay. Well, sell your house now. Yeah. All right. How many have heard of white nose syndrome? Wow, that's very good. This is a big deal. Bat populations throughout much of the eastern United States, and increasingly so in the Midwest, aren't doing well. They've collapsed because of this disease, this syndrome called white nose syndrome. It was first detected in 2006 in a cave in New York. It is a fungus. The syndrome was brought about by a fungus that affects hibernating bats, and it causes hibernating bats to awake during hibernation and to become active. So if you're a small mammal in a cave with a very stable temperature and humidity, and you're trying to make it through the winter on a very limited amount of fat reserves, and you've got a fungus that is infecting your skin, creating perforations and holes in your wings, causing you to itch, and you need to awake and get food in January when it's 5 degrees out and you feed on insects, what do you think the fate of that animal is going to be? Not very good. And that's what's happened. Maryland has had great population monitoring data for decades. And so we have some of the best data to show the effects of white nose syndrome. In 2010 is when it was first detected in Maryland at a cave in Allegheny County, just north of Cumberland. It's unknown really what the impacts are going to be from this incredible loss. The economic impact. It's tough to figure out, but it's probably going to be very, very high. Bats eat a lot of insects. No, but that's a great question. Some bats hibernate in caves, and those are the ones that are affected. Others, and this is still being sorted out, but they definitely don't nest in caves, but it's thought that they nest in the or they hibernate in the leaf litter, or maybe in a cavity in a tree. Those bats are not affected. The fungus, which was thought to be introduced by cavers who were caving in Europe, came to the United States, their equipment, their clothes had the spores, and it was introduced into cave systems here in North America. That's how it got here. So that fungus requires dark, cool, moist conditions which aren't found outside of a cave environment. Interestingly, Europe's bat species, for the most part, are unaffected. They've evolved with this fungus. They can deal with it. Our bats simply can't. And here's just a quick slide depicting the advance of white nose syndrome throughout North America. The blue are the earliest detections. You can see that red dot right there. That was where it was first detected in North America. And then it's kind of spread out by there, from there. And it's this county level. Right around here is where it was first detected in Maryland and Allegheny County. More recent years, 2016, 17, 18, you can see the advance westward. And somehow it ended up out here as well. And these are the species that are affected that we have here in Maryland. The Indiana bat, even prior to white nose syndrome, was a state and federally endangered species. Eastern small-footed Microtus was also state listed as endangered. Northern long-eared bats are now state and federally listed because of white nose. Now remember, folks, little brown bats, big brown bats, tricolors, and long-eared, these were common bats. 15 years ago, you could sit on your porch, and as the sun's fading on the horizon, you could probably look up, and if you knew how to identify bats really well, which I don't, you could probably see these bats flying around your room, eating some insects, and they're mostly gone. It's quite an event, unfortunately. Okay. I'll skip through this here. This is just depicting some of the monitoring data we have for individual caves. Okay, that's my segue into highlighting this bar right here in this graphic. Yeah. That's a good question. It might, although, most of the, not most, but certainly a large percentage of the insects that bats would feed on are night-flying insects that may not be available to birds which primarily forage during the day. There are a few exceptions like whippoorwills and chuckwills, woodlands, nighthawks, but most of our birds are daytime feeders. It just brings up, trying to ponder what the effects would be. We have over 2,500 species of moths. Some are of concern to farmers and foresters. They do have impacts. Most are beneficial. They're a critical food source for a lot of wildlife species, but what's going to happen as bats are no longer filling the niches they once did as a feeder of insect populations? And here's an oak beauty moth, a fairly common forest insect. Cerulean warblers feed quite a bit on, it's an inchworm. Inchworms is this broad group of geometric caterpillars, and bats as well feed on them. So insect biodiversity, not an option. You may know that plant-eating insects can only eat plants with which they've co-evolved. 90% of all plant-eating insects can only feed on plants from 3 or fewer plant families. So when you see a caterpillar on your deck, chances are it can only feed on certain plant species. It's not a broad-range forager. Most can only survive on just a few closely related plant species. And, this is important, native plants support a far greater diversity in number of insects than non-native plants. So oak, all the different oak species in the Mid-Atlantic, for example, at least 550 or so moth species are dependent on oaks. So imagine if we lost our oaks and we didn't have those moths, the impacts on birds, the impacts on bats, additional impacts on bats, kind of piling on. And you can really kind of sum it up in these terms. Greater native plant diversity on your property, on public lands, is equal to greater insect diversity. That in turn is equal to more diverse, abundant, and reliable food sources for wildlife. And that in turn means greater biodiversity and ecosystem services. So now I'm kind of segueing very quickly into what can we do. Let's say I'm a landowner in Garrett County. What can we do? Well, there's lots of things. The first thing, protect your land in perpetuity. Don't let it become this. This is at or on the top of the list of why wildlife isn't doing too well in Maryland and elsewhere in the world. Suburban sprawl. Consider a conservation easement. Forest fragmentation. We know habitat loss is pretty obvious. If the habitat, whether it's a forest, a salt marsh, or a shale burn, is no longer there, and that's what a species requires, it's a pretty obvious impact. There's something more subtle going on, though, when we lose, in this case, forests. As forests become increasingly smaller, more sinuous in their edges, and more isolated, in other words, the nearest other neighboring tract of forest, maybe hundreds of meters or miles away, that has an impact on wildlife as well. And it's called an edge effect. And the edge effect can extend maybe 50 feet, could be 1,000 feet, depending on the organism. But for sure, we know for many species, 300 feet, the outer 300 feet of a forest tract can experience edge effects. And edge effects used to be a positive thing in the early days of wildlife management. Wildlife managers were trying to maximize edge because game species, the main target of wildlife management, favored those edges. Some did at least. Nowadays, we have a fuller picture of wildlife conservation, and we know that that can have negative impacts. So there's going to be lower plant diversity along this edge. You're going to have more invasives. Birds are going to have a hard time reproducing along this edge because of more predators, more brood parasitism by brown-headed cowbirds. And I could spend an hour just talking about forest birds. There's fewer insect pollinators along this edge. A lower diversity in numbers of other wildlife like salamanders and snails. And some species just outright avoid edges. If you're an ovenbird or a wood thrush, you tend to avoid those. That doesn't mean you will never see a wood thrush or an ovenbird nesting or foraging near a forest edge, but the bulk of the population is in the interior. So some things you can do on your property. And this might be a tough pill, but forego timber harvesting if you can, especially in or near mature to old-growth forest, as well as a rich mesic forest. What is a rich mesic forest? It's a forest that has very rich soils. And why do I say that? Those rich mesic forests tend to support a greater diversity of certain wildlife groups like salamanders and forest nesting birds, spring wildflowers. And they're also particularly vulnerable to invasions by non-native plants. Forested wetlands and floodplain forests, and finally unique habitats. And I'll talk about some habitat-specific land management practices or considerations for unique habitats. Minimize forest fragmentation. Try not to create any permanent forest openings in your forested land, and try to avoid putting roads, permanent roads, that create edge habitat for your forest. If you do have to have roads, a lot of forest tracts you want to maintain some access. Try to minimize the length and the width of them, and certainly the number of them. Try to avoid a vast network of roads and trails. And where you do have roads, try to maintain canopy closure over those roads. Don't daylight. Daylighting is where you open up the canopy and you allow young vegetative growth to grow along the sides. Usually, in today's landscape, what that daylighting does, it's a welcome mat for invasive plants, and you're making it easier for predators and brood parasites of forest nesting birds to get into that area and use it. Try to maintain riparian buffers, stream buffers, ideally at least 300 feet. As you're planning, if you're doing timber harvesting, try to think long term. try to reserve some areas as future mature to old growth forests. If you're going to be doing timber harvesting, try to favor uneven age management, where you're doing selection, single tree selection or group selection, and try to implement longer rotations rather than a 60-year rotation. Try to shoot for an 80 to 100, maybe even 120. These older habitats, these less disturbed habitats, support greater biodiversity, and in some cases, species they're doing particularly poorly and need some help. And of course, control invasive species. And finally, reduce deer densities. That's a tall order, I know. But, you know, the majority of Maryland really has too many deer. There's still some places where that may not be true. But, yeah, deer have a big impact. They reduce forest structure. They you know, make it difficult for tree regeneration to occur. They have an impact on other wildlife species, so try to reduce deer density. So unique or sensitive habitats, you may have some of these on your property. You may have some of these rocky or talus slopes. You may have a rock bar like this. These are really important habitats for, in this case, rattlesnakes here in Western Maryland. They may occur in the property, or wood rats. Try to minimize the disturbance in these habitats and try not to log in them. Create a little buffer around these habitats. You may, if you're in Western Maryland, you may have shale barrens on your property. Again, try not to do timber harvesting in this area and create a little buffer around it. Tread lightly. You may have seepage wetlands or spring. Again, a good buffer around those to protect the catchment areas is important. Or if you have a small sedge meadow like this that might have bog turtle, protect that as well. Streams and riparian buffers. This may be the most important thing one of the most important things I could try to communicate. Protect your streams. Try to keep forested buffers along those streams. Don't mow down to them. Don't allow livestock into the stream, which can create a lot of sedimentation and bank erosion. This is really what you're shooting for right here. And this, of course, is what you try to avoid. Not great water quality. Not a lot of trees there to capture runoff, to reduce nutrient loads in these streams. Fish and other aquatic life will be impacted. And really, it comes down to this. If you have a nice forest on your property, bordering the entire length of the stream, and most of the watershed or catchment area for that stream is forested, you're going to have a high-quality stream, period. You will. So a healthy forest is equal to a healthy stream. I mentioned Delmarva bays or Carolina bays earlier and vernal pools. These are seasonal wetlands. How are we doing on time, Jonathan? Okay. These are seasonal wetlands. You may be familiar with them. It's usually a small basin, could be half the size of this room, could be a few acres in size. They're usually not very deep, maybe knee deep, maybe chest deep. They fill with water over the winter into spring, and usually by late summer, there's no water left. That is a perfect nursery ground for amphibians. And so some frog species, some toads, and certainly some salamanders really specialize in using those wetlands as breeding habitat. And here are some examples here in the bottom. Marbled salamanders, spotted salamanders, those may be on your property. And they need these places to reproduce. And one of the important features of these wetlands is an absence of fish, because the fish will feed on the eggs and the larvae of the amphibians. So it's this fish-free seasonal environment that is perfect for these salamanders. Now, of course, it's a race against the clock. The eggs are trying to hatch, and the larvae are trying to get big enough to go through metamorphosis and leave the wetland before it dries out. Some years they make it, some years they don't. But if the population is doing well, there's a net gain over time. So this is what a Carolina bay or a vernal pool would look like, say, in January. The basin is mostly filled, and then by the time you get to the summer months, see there's not much left. Folks familiar with vernal pools? Is that something you're familiar with? Okay. So the amphibians that are using these vernal pools spend most of their life in a terrestrial environment in the forested area surrounding the pool. And there's been some really interesting studies done tracking the movements in this case salamanders and wood frog, and seeing how far out from the vernal pool they go. And the individual salamanders and frogs tend to use the same pool throughout their lives. So they return to it just like a salmon returning to its natal stream habitat. And these buffer areas or life zones give you an idea of how far out these amphibians go. And especially with the salamanders, they're strongly associated with older forests. So a young forest will be used less by these species than older forests. So the extent that you could minimize any disturbance surrounding the vernal pools would be very beneficial to these salamanders and frogs. And so here, this is on some public land, a management plan that involves protection of Delmarva bays on the eastern shore. The light blue areas are Conservation Zone 1. That would be a no-cut 100-foot buffer around the basin. And then in the area further out, up to 500 feet, there would be limited timber harvesting involving some selection cuts with longer rotations. Grasslands. Anyone have grasslands on their property here? Grasslands? Okay, got a few people. So grasslands, we think of Maryland as being predominantly forested historically, but there were, and there still are, some native grasslands. And examples of native grasslands include serpentine grasslands. If you've ever been to Soldier's Delight in Baltimore County, it's a serpentine grassland. These are very unique, almost inhospitable soils, but some really rare, unique plants are found there. And historically, it was maintained by periodic fires. And Maryland DNR has spent a lot of time trying to restore that grassland at Soldier's Delight. Limestone glades, another semi-open grass-dominated habitat in oak savannas. It's thought that the Great Valley here, where Hagerstown is located, this Great Valley and the Blue Ridge, was more of an open oak savanna-like habitat that may have supported bison. Imagine that. But nowadays, if you're a private landowner, chances are you don't have one of these really rare, unique native grassland remnants. But you may have a meadow, you may have a field that you want to manage. As it turns out, there are some bird species that are absolutely dependent on grasslands. These are not forest nesting birds or shrub nesting birds. These need grasslands. They are specialists. So bobolinks, meadowlarks, henslow sparrows, they need grass. They need, and not just a small little meadow, maybe the size of this room, but usually big blocks. A minimum of 10 acres. Some species, like henslow sparrow, require very large blocks of grassland, over 100 acres. Habitat shape is important, and fragmentation is important. So big blocks rather than narrow strips are what's favorable for these species if you have a grassland. Try to avoid mowing those grasslands during the nesting season. You can hold off till just after July, maybe after July 4th. That allows these birds, some of which nest on the ground or just above the ground, gives them a chance to raise a clutch of eggs. You might want to manage these grasslands in a rotational manner. So if you say you have a 50-acre field, you could manage 10 acres. You could mow 10 acres one year, 10 acres the next year, the year after that, in a rotational way. Provide different vegetative structure and different grass heights that attract different species. So bobolinks, for example, like really tall grass. If you're a grasshopper sparrow or a savanna sparrow, you're like fairly short grass. If you're able to, fire is a great tool for managing grasslands. And finally, if you really want to maximize the wildlife benefits, usually fields or meadows meet up against a forest. Try to avoid that hard edge where the tall trees in a forest come right up against the field. Try to create a soft edge where you have a gradient, an ecotone of younger trees extending out and shrubs out into the field. And you have some early successional habitat benefits as well. Speaking of which, early successional habitat. In today's world, early successional habitat is usually thought of as young forest. And that's mostly what we have. But you can have early successional habitat in other ways. You can have, again, here's a meadow where you have that soft edge, and this right here, early successional habitat. Here's your grassland. if there's your forest. You may have a wetland. There's a wetland in Garrett County where you have some early successional habitat in the form of alder shrub wetlands along this wetland edge. Or you may have a beaver impounded area that creates great early successional habitat. If you're a woodcock hunter, that's the place to be, or one of the places to be during hunting season. So there's lots of ways you can create early successional habitat. Again, you can allow natural succession to occur in existing field or opening. You can let beavers do the work if you're lucky to have a stream or a wetland where beavers are around. You can create those soft edges, avoid the hard edges. Try to use prescribed burns if you can as a management tool for creating early successional and grassland habitat. And with timber harvesting, do it in a way that has benefits for both species that require forest as well as the younger forest. Minimize fragmentation, create your forest cuts near existing edges, try to retain some canopy trees in the cut area, snags and slash, and then, of course, control invasives. Try to control invasives before you cut as well as after. If you can kind of nip it in the bud, if you have, say, Japanese stilt grass or Japanese knotweed, you know it's there, you got a patch or two over here and there, get rid of it before you come in and do some timber harvesting and make it easier to control afterwards. So finally, I want to talk about backyard management. So this is kind of the low-lying fruit. Okay, I cut grass. I have grass on my property. I try to minimize it. And I want to have a little bit of room so my kids can play soccer, play horseshoes, or cornhole in the backyard. But really, mowed grass is about as useless as it comes for wildlife. It's a biological desert. The less mowed grass you have, the better. So although it looks great, it may have, it may be the look you need to sell your house. So what you want to do on your property, in your backyard, let's say, this is backyard management, what you can see outside your front or back door, try to replicate the structure, the vegetative structure that you can see in the forest. So some big trees, some small trees, some shrubs, some wildflowers. Try to limit it to native species. Plant habitat for pollinators. There's some purple coneflower, other native shrubs. That might be too close to your home, maybe not the look you want, but you can design something. You can make it appeal to you aesthetically, but still do some good things for wildlife. And really, it's as simple as, you create it, and you're going to see a positive response. And it's probably one of the more gratifying things you can do as a landowner. These really simple things, whether it's creating pollinator habitat, having monarchs on your property, or putting out nest boxes for birds, or bat boxes, or creating more plant diversity in the property. Those are pretty easy things to do. Even creating like a shrub pile. Good for snakes, good for bunnies, small mammals, good habitat altogether. And then finally, I'll come back to this. Protect your land in perpetuity. Don't contribute to sprawl. Folks, that's about all I have. Be happy to take any questions. I know I just covered a lot of ground.